I want to go to Charles Bullock, who is a UGA professor in political science, a political scientist as well. Charles, thank you for your patience. You've been on with us since we got on the air, listening to the motorcade arriving at the state capitol, all the way through the service at the Carter Center that ended just moments ago. If you can, Mr. Bullock, reflect on Jimmy Carter's legacy and how he's being remembered at the time of his death at this point.
Well, something that really isn't talked about much. I think maybe the things we get most remembered for will be his life after he was president. He had an awfully long life there. No one else has had a post-presidential career like he did for 44 years. And what do our other ex-presidents do? Well, they may make a lot of money by giving speeches. They may build a library and largely disappear from public life. But he didn't. Instead, he enveloped himself with every man, with every woman, with his extensive work building houses, with his efforts to educate. He was very active as an educator at Emory University, where for many years the entire freshman class, he would meet with them, try to inspire them. He would be available also to the student body there, people who were doing research. Yes, he would work with them, whether they were faculty members, students, or researchers around the world. So he continued to be very much involved and out in real life, rather than kind of being something inapproachable, as I think many of our ex-presidents seem to be.
Can we also talk a little bit about the guinea worm? That is something that many people were not talking about, but that is something he, his staff, and his center tackled, and now it's almost eradicated because of his efforts.
Well, that's right. Now, a terrible disease, very painful, and as Jason said in his comments, went from millions of people down to now just a handful of people who are still being infected by this. So he also worked against river blindness. So the Carter Center, yes, very much involved in healthcare, health of the human, but then also health of the body politic. And so the Carter Center was also very much involved in trying to encourage, oversee, promote democratic elections in jurisdictions all around the world. So that was another area which hasn't gotten much attention, but I think is a very important part of his legacy, his efforts to promote understanding and democracy.
Talk about, I mean, you touched on it a little bit here, how just ahead of his time he was in promoting democracies, something that to some degree we have to fight for, and promoting human rights when it wasn't really the popular thing to do. Talk about just how forward-thinking he was in those efforts and the legacy that he leaves behind with that.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, he first gets elected. This time he runs for public office, he gets elected in 1962. Well, at that point, if you'd gone to the Georgia General Assembly, it was essentially an all-white affair. Indeed, the first African American to be elected to any legislature in the South in the 20th century gets elected at the same time that Carter does in 1962, takes office in 63. Essentially, no women would be seen holding public office in Atlanta or most jurisdictions. So what did he do? Well, as governor, he himself as governor couldn't elect, but he could appoint. And so he created the Judicial Nominating Commission, which is still kind of what you pass through on your way to a judgeship today. And he began appointing minorities and women to judgeships. He continued to do that then once he became president. He appoints the first black woman to serve in a cabinet position, Patricia Harris, appoints her. And so he was continually looking for opportunities to broaden the representation that we see in appointive offices, in the administrative offices that a president and a governor is overseeing. And so he begins that process of making those who are, administering the laws look more and more like America, with the kind of diversity, both gender and race.
Mr. Bullock, I mean, you touched on all those things. Andrew Young last Sunday said that a lot of his views could have cost him the election, but he still went ahead. In the history books, once it's all printed out in black and white, how do you think his legacy will be remembered, or how do you hope that it will be remembered?
Yeah, well, as any president does, of course, he faced a number of challenges, and there were particularly serious challenges during his tenure. I mean, it's during his tenure that we had the first real, petroleum crisis. All of a sudden, you can't buy gas on Sundays, for example. Prices go way up. Uh, Associated somewhat with that then was what happened in Iran with the taking over the embassy and the holding of the hostages there. But here in domestic politics, we were seeing people, you were paying more than 10% on a mortgage. And so that was also very difficult. He was a president at a time of inflation, as we saw this year. You don't want to have inflation as a problem when you're president, because if you do, then that's the kind of thing which very much impacts every person in daily life, and it may then cost you your reelection. And it was certainly one of the major factors in why he was only a one-term president. Did he have some successes? Yes, he did. And perhaps the biggest one would be the Camp David Accords. And of course, I think in creating the Carter Center and physically laying it out like he did, I think he was probably thinking back to that success he had in bringing together the leaders of Israel and Egypt to work out a peaceful accord, which is still in place today. So he was very successful in that regard.
Yeah, we were playing a little bit of his campaign videos. He was campaigning for president, and it's so neat to hear the story how he was this virtual unknown nationally. I remember hearing a story about after his mother came back into the United States after serving on a mission, that he said to his mother, Jimmy Carter said to his mother, well, I'm going to run for president. And she said, president of what? Because the idea that he would run for president of the United States, it seemed like such a long shot. Talk about just the unprecedented nature of his successful election to office. This boy from a small Georgia town called Plains.
Well, that's right. Yeah. And so he was not groomed to become president. I mean, Georgia's had lots of other governors. And none of them have been able to make that kind of transition. Also, something else. He is the first Southerner to be elected to the presidency since James Knox Polk, and that was in 1844. Now, part of the reason you didn't see very successful Southern politicians being elected president for 100 years or so was because of their attitudes, their stands on issues relating to race. And Carter overcomes that, we've already touched upon. And then he gets credit for putting an end to the George Wallace era. George Wallace runs for president, very much kind of a white supremacy campaign in the 1960s, 1972, is running again in 76, and Carter defeats him in Florida. And that puts an end to that aspect of the old Democratic Party.
Well, Charles Bullock, thanks so much for joining us. We could talk all day or 4 hours about all of the legacy there. Thank you for being with us. Now, we do want to recap the day.